All right, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Jackson Dowden, and I'm a solutions architect with QuickSight. And today we'll be covering how you can enhance your embedded analytics with the generative BI capabilities of Amazon Q in QuickSight. So taking a quick look at our agenda for today, we'll start by doing a brief overview of the Amazon Q in QuickSight capabilities, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, before discussing the recent updates to embedded analytics that allow you to leverage some of these features in custom websites and applications. We'll then move to a demo to see these capabilities in a live embedded environment before wrapping up with some resources and Q&A. So with that being said, let's jump right in. So hopefully most of you are already familiar with the Amazon Q and QuickSight capabilities, as today's session isn't focused as much on the features themselves, and rather is primarily focused on how we can bring them into embedded environments. But as a quick review, we'll still just take a few minutes to go through each of the features at a high level. And as we go through them, if anything is unfamiliar, or you want to take a deeper dive into any individual feature, we have some great resources on the QuickSight community, our YouTube channel, and in our documentation that we can share and direct you to for after this session. But at a high level, the Amazon Q and QuickSight features are all targeted at accelerating the process of deriving insights and meaning from your data, enabling you to make data-driven decisions. This includes capabilities focused on authoring, so enabling you to build dashboards and reports faster. It also includes storytelling capabilities, allowing you to surface and share findings in presentation-ready formats. Next, and most recently, Q provides an AI agent to help you perform complex data analysis. And lastly, it enables you to quickly ask questions about your data to get answers on demand. And all of these features are made possible by Amazon Bedrock. Now looking a little closer at each of these capabilities, starting with the AI-powered authoring experience, this feature allows you and your analysts to build visuals, build calculations, and refine visuals, all using natural language. So this is aiming to accelerate that time to build dashboards and reports from hours to minutes. As you can see while the video on screen plays, you don't have to learn tool-specific syntax to create calculations. And instead of building visuals using the normal drag and drop experience you may already be familiar with if you've used QuickSight before, you're now able to describe what visuals you want in plain English. And each of these AI-powered authoring capabilities are available for your Author Pro users. Next is our AI-assisted storytelling feature called Data Stories, which, unlike dashboards and reports, is more like a document or presentation used to explain data in a narrative form. So this feature helps you rapidly generate a first draft of a data story that you can then customize, modify, and expand to refine the experience. You're also able to bring in unstructured data files to augment the structured data that you use in your dashboard visuals to enrich your story. And by keeping your story within QuickSight, you can make sure that you maintain governance and ensure that your data is always up to date. More recently, we also announced our scenarios capability, which empowers you to perform advanced data analysis without needing specialized skills or training. So using an AI agent, you can ask questions in natural language to dive deep into your business data, understanding past trends, forecasting future scenarios, and getting recommendations on what to do next. And this experience allows you to perform complex data analysis up to 10 times faster than using spreadsheets, so still has that focus on acceleration. Finally, the last two features I want to cover just a high level are the executive summaries and the multi-visual Q&A. So the executive summaries feature allows you to see key insights from your dashboards summarized in natural language, and the Q&A experience enables you to ask questions of your data in plain English and receive multi-visual responses generated on demand. So if a dashboard doesn't have the visuals that you need to conduct your analysis, you can simply ask a question and generate visual responses in seconds without having to go back to your BI teams and wait for dashboard updates. So that was just a really quick overview of the generative BI features. And now we can discuss how you can use them to extend your own custom applications with AI. So in case you aren't already familiar with the QuickSight embedding options, you have 4 different asset types that you can embed. And these are individual visuals, full dashboards, the entire QuickSight console, or that multi-visual Q&A experience that we just saw on the previous slide. And each of these embedded experiences support all of the QuickSight data sources and can be themed to seamlessly match the look and feel of your hosting application. So as I just mentioned, you've already been able to bring the power of Amazon Q into your applications through the embedded Q&A experience for a while now. And an example of this is being shown here on screen. But it's important to note that the embedded console has been limited to non-generative BI functionality. That means that each of the other features, like data stories, executive summaries, AI-powered authoring, etc., these have not previously been available in embedding. So if you've ever accessed an embedded QuickSight console as an author, you would only have seen the sections on the sort of regular QuickSight assets, like datasets, analyses, and dashboards. You wouldn't have seen sections for the other generative BI features that we just discussed. However, that actually changed recently with our launch of Generative BI embedding options. And this was on April 1st. So now, in addition to the Q&A experience, you can enable the embedded console to include the ability to create data stories, leverage Generative BI-based authoring, manage Q topics, which are what power that Q&A experience, and also leverage that Q&A experience within the console as opposed to embedded separately. Additionally, both of the embedded dashboards and embedded console now also come with the ability to enable executive summaries on your dashboards. Now, one important thing I want to note here is that this is only available in registered user embedding. So we have 2 possible embedding methods with QuickSight, each with their own API versions. And these are the registered user embedding and the anonymous embedding. So these features are only available for registered user embedding and only for users with the appropriate user roles, like author or reader pro, depending on the feature. Now, before we take a look at what these generative BI capabilities look like within an embedded experience, I want to quickly walk through the embedded workflow and see what you need to do to actually leverage these features. So at a high level, there are 3 key steps in the embedding workflow. And the first is setting up the right backend permissions for your application or web server. So making sure that it has the permissions necessary to actually call the QuickSight APIs. Once you have those permissions, the next step is to then actually call the APIs, in this case, the generate embed URL APIs, in order to generate an embeddable asset URL that contains the user authentication code. Finally, once you have that asset URL, the last step is to utilize the JavaScript embedding SDK to actually embed the asset into your website. So these are the 3 key steps to that embedding workflow. Now, looking closer at each one, starting with the backend permissions, here on screen, we have an example IAM policy that includes the permissions necessary for your application. So at minimum, it must have the permission to call the generate embed URL API on behalf of your application users. Notice how we specifically are providing permission for the generate embed URL for registered user API and not the anonymous user version, as again, the generative BI features specifically are only available with registered user embedding. So if you've worked with embedded QuickSight before, this may look familiar, as no changes are needed on this step to enable the generative BI features. These are the same permissions that are required for embedding, whether Gen BI features are involved or not. But now we can come to step 2, which is then generating the asset URLs using that API. And when you call this API, there are a few request parameters where you pass in information like your AWS account ID and the QuickSight user that you're calling the API on behalf of. But most of the configuration is done in the experience configuration parameter, which I've put on screen here. This is where you define the experience that you want to embed. So again, you can choose from a visual, a dashboard, the Q&A experience, or the QuickSight console. And for each embedding type, there are then a series of subparameters that you can enable or disable. So in this example on screen, you can see that we've chosen the QuickSight console. And for that type, we have lots of options, like, and these are under feature configurations. So you'll see things like state persistence. So that's controlling whether it will remember filter selections between site visits. Or you can also enable or disable schedules, which determines whether your users will be able to configure emailed reports. But the feature configuration that was recently added and relevant to our discussion today is Amazon Q in QuickSight. And this actually has 4 sub-properties that can be enabled or disabled to control which generative BI features will be available in the embedded console. And these are the data Q&A, the data stories, the executive summaries, and the generative BI powered authoring. So if you want these generative BI features to be made available in your embedded console, then when you call the generate embed URL API, you must add Amazon Q in QuickSight under the feature configurations and specifically enable these 4 parameters by setting them to true. And while this example is for the embedded console, here is another example for an embedded dashboard. So it's the same generate embed URL for registered user API call, and we still have to define an experience configuration. But instead of the QuickSight console, we're now choosing the dashboard option. Notice how the dashboard has very similar options for the feature configurations. And just like with the console, there's now a new option for Amazon Q in QuickSight. However, while this parameter had 4 possible options for the embedded console, the only option to enable for the embedded dashboards is executive summary. Now, once you've configured whether to enable or disable each of the features that you want, like the Amazon Q in QuickSight features, then when you call the API, you're going to get a response that looks something like this. So it will give a status and a request ID, and most importantly, it will include an embedded URL for the asset that you requested, like the dashboard or the console. And the last step will be to take this URL and embed it using the SDK. And in order to do that, you're going to take the URL from that API response, you're going to insert it into the URL property for the frame options parameter when using the SDK. Now, if this sample code looks unfamiliar, or you've never seen the embedding SDK before, we have some resources that we can share after this session that go into more detail, but I'm just going to briefly cover this at a high level. So when you use the embedding SDK, you will call a method to embed an asset, like the embed console or the embed dashboard method. So there's a method depending on which asset type that you're embedding. And each of these methods takes 2 parameters, frame options and content options. You can see us making this method call at the very bottom here. So you can see we're calling the embed console method, and we're passing in frame options and content options. And you can see that we're defining what frame options and content options are just above in the sample code. So frame options is where we define what we are embedding and where. So it has a URL property where we provide the URL returned by that API call. So that's what we're embedding. And then the container property is how we define the HTML element where the QuickSight asset will be embedded. So frame options is required because it's the core of what we're doing here. We decide what we're embedding and where. Content options, on the other hand, is an optional parameter that allows us to define additional configurations. So you can do things like defining parameter values or sheet options for dashboards or setting a locale for language, things like that. Now, neither this process of using the SDK or these frame options or content options parameters are new with the Generative BI capabilities. But what is new is that content options now has new properties where we can define whether the Gen BI features will be enabled. So under content options and then under toolbar options, you can now set the following properties to true or false. And these are executive summaries, data Q&A, and build visual. And these are specific for when you're embedding the console. And this will this setting to true or false will then cause the corresponding features to be enabled or disabled within your embedded console. And we'll see shortly how this looks in the embedded environment. But similarly, if you're embedding a dashboard using the SDK, you'll still call the SDK method and define the frame options and content options parameters. It's just as you can see at the bottom, instead of the embed console, we're now calling the embed dashboard method. And just like before, there are new Gen BI options under the toolbar options of the content options parameter. But similarly to the experience configuration of the API, with dashboards, there's only one option to set to true or false, which is the executive summaries. So to take a step back and to summarize, the high-level workflow and steps for embedding QuickSight has not changed. But there are some new properties under the API and the SDK that need to be enabled and set to true in order to see these Gen BI features reflected in your embedded dashboards and consoles. So these were the Amazon Q and QuickSight properties of the feature configurations in the API, and the toolbar option properties of the content options parameter in the SDK. Now, one last thing I want to cover before we move to the demo is that there are also some new properties available with the embedded Q&A experience. So while the Gen BI properties are new to embedded dashboards and consoles, the embedded Q&A experience has already been available for a while now. However, there are some new SDK options that provide you with more flexibility to customize the experience within your application. So this is a very similar example, but specific to Q&A. So once again, the method at the bottom that we're calling, instead of embed console or embed dashboard, is now embed generative Q, but we're still passing in frame options and content options. Frame options just isn't shown in the slide because we're running out of space. But as you can see in content options, we have tons of new options available that you can enable or disable by setting to true or false. Now, we won't go through each one individually, but essentially you can enable or disable each component of the multi-visual response that you'll get back from Q&A. So like whether it will include how the question was interpreted, or whether it will provide a generated textual narrative on the left, or the complementary visuals. And we're going to see an example of this in just a few minutes. So with that being said, let's move to an embedded environment. We've put all this together so we can see each feature in action. So I'm just going to switch my screen share here. And you should now be seeing my browser window where I'm going to be logging into my application here. So notice that I'm not logging into QuickSight. This is my own custom application login page. And once this page loads, you're going to see that this is an example website for the fake anycompany.com. And on this starting page, I've embedded two things. So at the top, I've embedded the generative Q&A experience as an expandable search bar. And then below that, I've embedded the full QuickSight dashboard. So I can scroll through this dashboard, I can interact with it, see that I can add different filters and whatnot. And this should all be familiar for embedded dashboard experiences. But what is new is this button at the top right that says Summarize. So this button is only showing up because I set the property of executive summaries to true in both my API call and in the SDK. And this button allows me to then generate this executive summary where I can see these key insights that summarize my dashboard. So you can see I'm getting these 3 bullet points that summarize some of what we're seeing in these visuals. So for example, it says my top 3 industries by sales are finance, healthcare, and manufacturing, which we can see reflected in our sales by industry donut chart here. So finance, healthcare, and manufacturing are our top 3. Now, outside of the summarize button, I can also go back to the Q&A and ask questions of my data, but I actually want to come back to this one in just a couple minutes here. So now I'm going to use the menu on the left, and I'm going to navigate away from the embedded dashboard to the self-service page where I've embedded the entire QuickSight console. Now notice here that I've applied branding to match the look and feel of the console to my website styling. So I've got like our company logo instead of the QuickSight logo, and I've got these different colors here that these colors are different from what you'll see if you logged into your QuickSight console and hadn't applied any branding. I also want to point out that on the navigation on the left within the console, you'll see that we now have all these different sections. So in addition to the data sets, analyses, and dashboards, we also have these Gen BI sections. So we have the topic section where we can now create, manage, and share our QuickSight Q topics, which again, these are what power the Q&A experience. We also have a whole tab dedicated to the data stories. Now, if I come back to my favorites, and if I open up my dashboard, you'll also see that there's 3 new buttons that come up here within my dashboard, which is within my embedded console. So the first button is the Q&A button. And this will open up this window where I can start asking questions of my data. So I can just I can ask any question I want, or I can pick from any of these verified questions. So I'll just ask for the top selling products. And we're going to get this multi-visual response. So I want you to take note of all the different components here. So we've got things like the interpreted as, so how did it interpret our question? We've got sections on where we can provide feedback, or there's our primary visual that's answering our main question. So we can see these are our top selling products because these are each of our products ranked by their sales. And that's answering our primary question, but we've also got all these complementary visuals that aren't necessarily exactly what I asked for, but provide more additional context. So like what were our total sales and what was our sales across how many products? We have 14 products. Where are we making our sales? We've also got some tabular details. And then on the left, we've also got this textual narrative summary of what we're seeing in these visuals on the right. So I can come back and I can ask other questions too, like I can ask for our regional sales. I can ask whatever question I want here, but every time I ask a question, I'm going to get this sort of multi-visual response with our primary visual, then our complementary visuals, and this textual narrative. And I want to take note of that because when we go back to where we've embedded the Q&A separately, we're going to see how we can use those new SDK options to sort of customize this experience. But leaving the Q&A, the next button is that same summarize button as what we saw on the embedded dashboard. So just like before, this generates a few key insights for some of that data that we're seeing in our dashboard. And then that third and final button is the build story button. And when I click this, it'll actually navigate us to the data stories window, where we can describe a story that we want in natural language. So for example, we could make a story like, build a story about our sales trends across industries. We also want it to provide recommendations, how we can increase our regional sales. So we're not just looking for a couple visuals as a response. We want to really dive deep into our data, look at trends, and we also want recommendations. So we provide this the story that we want, and then we select visuals from our dashboard. So just select a few visuals. We could also add in any of our unstructured documents for additional insights. For now, because I don't have any, I'm just going to toggle that off and click build. Well, after we click build, this will take just a minute to generate a compelling story that we can then use to share insights. So you no longer have to take like screenshots of visuals and move them into a PowerPoint and spend time writing out the insights. So not only does this feature reduce the time and manual effort, but now you can make sure that the story is only shared with those who should have access by keeping it within QuickSight, and also making sure that the data is always up to date, as these visuals are connected to your underlying data within QuickSight. Once the story generates, we can see how we can edit and customize the story as we like. So we can see that we can choose a story style. So we can change it to be something like vivid, which will change the colors. As we scroll through, we'll see how it takes each of the visuals that we selected and then gives us these narrative summaries of what we're seeing from our data. So for example, in our monthly sales by segment, we can see like the SMB segment experienced a significant increase of 31% from November to December, for example. And while this was generated on our behalf, we still have complete control over it. So if we liked, particular insights, we could come in and bold them or underline them or even delete them and write our own insights. So we're able to completely customize this story and reorganize it as we like. We can also use AI to regenerate the text. So if we select this, we can have this either regenerate as longer, shorter, or change to bullets. Just an example, we can change this to bullets, and we can keep that and see that reflected here. So again, this is the same data stories feature that you might already be familiar with if you've gotten the chance to play with this within the QuickSight console already. But what's new is that we're now able to do this within the embedded console. Now, if I navigate away from this data story and come back to my favorites tab, I'm now going to open up an analysis, which is this author window. And here, we're also going to see that we now have some new buttons related to the Generative BI powered authoring. So next to our Add Visuals button, we now have a Build button. And when we click this, we'll be able to build a visual in natural language. So if I just switch to one of my data sets and I click Build, I can ask for a visual such as we want products by profit. When I build this, this will create a visual. Here we're seeing these are our top products ranked in a bar chart by the sum of their profits, which is what we were asking for. And if we like this visual, we can then add this directly to our analysis below. Additionally, if we come to adding a calculated field, if you're familiar, if you've used QuickSight before, you'll know that you can use any of our different functions and formulas to write your own calculated fields. If you want to do this in natural language, we now have this build calculation button available. So if you click on this button, you can describe what you want in natural language. So for example, we could say we wanted our profit over sales because we want to create a profit margin field. And after we describe that natural language, it'll generate that within our QuickSight specific syntax. This is now doing the sum of our profit field over the sum of our sales field. And if we're happy with that formula, then we can insert it and save it. And we'll now see that we have profit margin as a field that we can use in our visuals and questions. So again, just like with all these other features, if you've used these features in QuickSight before, these aren't necessarily new, but they're new in the embedded experience specifically. Now, the last thing I want to show is I'm going to return to the dashboard page where we've embedded both the dashboard and that Q&A experience. And we're going to ask the same question that we asked in the Q&A in the console. So we're going to ask for our top selling products. But what you're going to notice is that this response is going to look pretty different, where it's going to have a lot fewer of the different pieces of that answer. So we'll see that we still have the same primary visual, where we're seeing all of our products ranked in a bar chart by the sum of their sales, but we no longer have the interpreted as statement at the top, nor do we have a section to add feedback. We also don't have the complementary visuals like the additional KPIs and the tabular details, while we still have the generated narrative on the left. And that's because I've used those SDK options that we saw in the slides to remove each of those different components by setting them to false under the content options parameter. So I specifically said that I wanted to remove the interpreted as and wanted to remove the feedback in each of those other components, while saying that I still wanted to keep the generated narrative and we're always going to keep this primary answer. So now you can use these new SDK options to customize the responses that you get back to meet your own website's requirements. And we'll see the same thing if we ask a different question. So we come back and ask the same other question, so regional sales in 2022. We're going to see a similar response where we're only going to get the primary visual and the generated narrative back. So these are our 3 regions by their sales, specifically in 2022. But once again, we're not seeing the interpreted as, we can't provide feedback, and we don't see those complementary visuals. So it's completely up to you whether you want to enable or disable these different components of this Q&A response. So at this point, we've seen how you can leverage the generative BI features of executive summaries, AI-powered authoring, data stories, topic management, and Q&A within the console, all within your embedded applications, as well as seeing the most recent customization options for the embedded Q&A experience. We also saw the steps to accomplish these by using the Generate Embed URL for Registered User API, specifically with the Amazon Q and QuickSight experience configuration, and then using the resulting embed URL through the SDK with the specific content options properties that enable each feature.